So hello to everybody. My name is Alec Gerry. I'm a professor of veterinary entomology at UC Riverside. I'm also a cooperative extension specialist with UC Agricultural and Natural Resources, so UC A&R. Been at Riverside for about 18 years now. I work with insects that are pests of animals, including dairy cattle, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So my section will be discussing common fly pests of cattle in dairy production. Make sure I'm clicking on the right screen there. There we go. There are four fly species that in particular are common in dairy cattle or commonly impact dairy cattle. Two of these are biting flies. They include the stable fly here and the horn fly. Both of these flies have rigid mouth parts, and they use these rigid mouth parts to tear through the host skin and draw blood. And so these are the two blood-feeding flies. Call them biting flies, but you could call them blood-feeding flies as well. And you can see the stable fly here is actually engorged and carrying quite a bit of blood in this initial picture. At the bottom are two non-biting flies, the face fly and the house fly. These two species look very similar to each other, particularly the females. Female flies look very similar to each other. The males have some characteristics that we can distinguish between them. I'm not going to go into that much today because of time. But the important thing is that both of them are non-biting flies. The face fly is involved with the transmission of diseases. They feed around the eyes of animals, as we'll talk about here in a later slide, and can transmit pink eye, for example, as well as some nematodes. The house flies are more of a nuisance pest. And again, we'll discuss it a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so our non-biting flies, we can see in the picture on the left, this is face flies on cattle. In this case, it's beef cattle, but you can see that the flies are clustering around the eyes and on the nose. These flies feed on lacrimal secretions or eye secretions, as well as nasal secretions. So they like to cluster around those locations when they're feeding. And you might see a fly or two sort of dispersed across the face, but generally you don't see these flies on the rest of the body. And most of the flies, the vast majority, are clustering in these tight groups at these wet locations on the face of the animal. The picture on the right shows house flies on cattle. So you can see that in this picture, there are a few flies that are on the face of the cows. And actually, if you look back on the back, you'll see a few flies there as well. But you can see these flies aren't clustered. They don't cluster together in a group. They're just sort of haphazardly distributed across the animal, probably feeding on sweat excretions of the animal. And so that's a real difference between the two species and one way to tell them apart. Another important difference between these two flies is that face flies develop in very fresh cattle feces. So the adult flies will land on fresh cow poop, essentially just expressed cattle feces. They'll lay their eggs in that feces, and the immatures then will develop in that fresh feces. The house flies on the right generally develop in older feces, often feces mixed with wet organic materials like animal feed or haylage, silage, or other organic materials that get mixed in with the feces. So they're not going to use fresh cow feces. They're going to look for something that's a little older, a little aged. I like to call it aged, kind of like a fine wine. All right, so let's move on to the biting flies. The two biting fly species we talked about are the horn flies and the stable flies. On the left are horn flies, and horn flies generally cluster along the back of your cattle. They sometimes on hot days will actually move in mass to the underside of the cattle, and so they'll cluster there when it's too hot, too much sunlight directly on them. But they generally are there and present in very large numbers. They don't leave the animal. They stay on the animal all the time. They might move from animal to animal. So unlike lice, which will just stay on the one animal, they have no fidelity to any one particular animal, but they're not going to go very far if they don't have to. So they'll hop amongst adjacent animals. Maybe sometimes animals will bump into each other and scares all the flies up, and they all transfer to the new animal. But they don't leave the animal and go rest in the environment. Stable flies, on the other hand, will only be on the animal when they're biting, when they're feeding. and they bite along the legs and lower body of the animal. So you can see the picture in the right, the little black dots that are on the legs of this cow, of this dairy cow. Those are stable flies. So stable flies will always bite low down on cattle and on people too, by the way. They'll bite us on our lower legs. So if you go out in shorts, you might regret it. For dogs, stable flies bite on the ears or the back of the head. So it's a little different, perhaps because of their smaller size. And then stable flies don't remain on the animal. So after they bite, they take blood, they'll leave the animal and go rest in the environment. So that's a big difference between the horn flies and stable flies. Horn flies, again on the left there, always position themselves on the animal's body with a head down position. So you can see every fly in the picture here on the left is positioned similarly with their head pointed downward, so towards the ground. Stable flies do the opposite. They land on the animal and have their head pointed upward. And when they're feeding, you'll see that the head's actually embedded into the hair a little bit, but the head's always pointed upward as they're feeding. So that's another way to tell these two apart. In addition, stable fly is larger, about the size of housefly, while horn fly is smaller, about 3/4 the size of housefly. So some characteristics between the two. But again, both are blood feeding or biting flies. Horn flies, like face flies, prefer or actually only use fresh cattle feces. So they need fresh cattle feces for development. Stable flies are more like house flies. They prefer that older aged fine vintage manure. The egg to adult time differs by species of fly. It's very quick for house flies and face fly, about a week or so. Horn flies are a little bit longer to develop from egg to adult, and stable flies are longer still, about 12 days, so almost 2 weeks for stable flies to go from egg to adult. And that'll become important when we talk about their seasonal activity. So in the summer, we generally see housefly numbers peaking, increasing to the highest point. Face fly and horn fly often reach their highest counts during the summer as well. Some interesting things about face flies and horn flies is that face flies will overwinter as adults, which means they'll, as adults in the fall, the adults that are around will essentially fly off and find barns or other places to spend the winter, and they'll survive as adults all winter waiting for spring to warm up, and they'll come out again and lay eggs. Horn flies, on the other hand, overwinter as immatures in those manure pats. So they'll stop their immature development in late fall and just sit and rest in the feces, waiting for spring when they can finish their development. Stable fly is most common in spring and fall. They're actually quite susceptible to high temperature. So if we get into the higher summer temperatures, stable flies tend to die out. So we see their numbers being highest in spring, especially late spring and maybe very early summer, early part of June to mid-June, and then it drops off quickly after that. And there's also an association with early spring rainfall. I mentioned their development time is about 2 weeks. And so what we've seen before is that if you get late winter rains or early spring rains, like in March, within a few weeks or maybe a month, we start to see a peak in stable fly activity. And that's all the flies that have developed because of the wetting of their habitat. So two flies are not pasture flies. The two flies that do not develop in fresh feces, fresh cattle feces, are two that we generally see on dairies that lack pasture. And so that's the house fly and the stable fly. And from here on out, I'm going to talk mostly about the stable fly because that leads into the future or the next set of discussions. Oh, I forgot to mention, so house flies are known, of course, for nuisance and the potential for transmission of pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella. Whereas stable flies are known for their painful bites and the economic losses associated with those painful bites because of changes to animal behavior. And the reason that the stable fly has a painful bite is that it has this hardened mouth part called a proboscis that has rows of small teeth, and these teeth just tear into the skin in which they draw blood to feed on. So it's sort of like somebody taking a bunch of small needles and continuing to pick at your skin until finally the blood begins to flow. So it can be a very painful bite. These painful bites are generally to the legs and lower body of cattle. and result in the cattle expressing certain behaviors as they try to avoid these bites or dislodge the flies. And some of those behaviors, those characteristic behaviors, include leg stamps or leg stomps. And you see that in this picture, as well as a head toss. So this cow is actually doing both a leg stamp and a head toss. And sometimes you'll also see the tail swishing, going back and forth, and even a body shaking, trying to dislodge the flies. The body shaking actually occurs more with horn flies than it does with stable flies. The leg stomping is more typical with the stable flies, and the head tossing as well. What this figure shows you, this is 4 separate figures, but all of them tell the same story. And on the x-axis of all 4 of these is stable fly numbers. So as we move from the left to the right, we're increasing in numbers of stable flies on the legs of animals. And the y-axis is essentially the number of behaviors that the animal is expressing. And so what we can see is that as the stable fly numbers are increasing, the number of behaviors that the animal is expressing to try to throw off the flies is also increasing. In other words, the animals are spending much more of their time trying to throw flies off as the fly numbers increase, and that becomes important in terms of economic loss. Most importantly, when fly numbers are particularly high, the cattle begin to bunch. They develop, they go into these aggregations, these protective aggregations. And this is going to be really talked about in our next segment of the workshop. So I'm not going to say any more about it other than just to introduce that this is a real issue that stable flies are responsible for. Economically, stable flies are a problem for producers because as the stable fly numbers increase, again here on the x-axis, we see a loss in value, a loss in dollars, and that's for weight gains, but it's a similar result for milk yields. So we would expect milk yields to also be reduced, and therefore producers are losing money. There's going to be more discussion on this in the 3rd segment of the workshop, so I won't discuss this any further in this section either. I mentioned that houseflies have a life cycle from egg to adult. They go through actually 3 larval stages. You can see that in this picture. And most methods to control, I said houseflies, but I meant stable flies. Most methods to control stable flies are really focused, or should be focused, on controlling those development stages. Because if you don't have the adults, then we don't have all the problems associated with the adults. We know from many years of research that stable flies really like areas where feces are mixed with other wet organic materials, particularly things like hay or feed additives. So if you can mix feces, urine, and hay, stable flies are really happy. They really like that kind of habitat. Of course, we see that in pasture cattle. That kind of habitat is really common in pasture cattle. This is a picture from Kansas or Nebraska, showing kind of a typical area where we see stable fly issues along the Great Plains. But we also have these areas here in our dairies, our more modern dairies. Lots of the older manure buildup, the aged manure that gets built up underneath fence lines and around waters or in feeding areas is really nice habitat for stable flies, especially if it gets mixed with a little bit of urine in there too. So we do have plenty of development sites on our dairies in California also. Stable flies are particularly associated with rain because they do like that older manure, but they also need the manure to be a little wetted. A rain event kind of kicks things into gear for them. So the rain wets the manure, that older manure, and provides them with a development site. Whatever flies are around then are able to lay eggs, and we get sort of this bloom of stable flies perhaps 3 or 4 weeks later, or at least 2 weeks later, depending on temperature. We know from previous research that if it rains in March, we can expect high numbers of stable flies in May and early June. So that's something to watch out for. If you know there's a March rain, it's probably a good idea to tell your producers. You might look for ways to try to control stable flies because there's probably going to be a bad year. One of the problems with stable fly management is that a lot of the development actually occurs off-site. So the producers maybe don't have full control over the stable fly production and the number of adult stable flies. And that's because these stable flies will develop in any wet organic material, from grass clippings to composted areas. to manure that's been applied to agricultural fields that gets wetted after a rain. So there's lots of sources for development that maybe not under direct control of the producer. And for that reason, management can be very difficult. We're going to discuss a little bit more on stable fly management in the final section of this workshop. So I'm going to finish with this slide. This is my when stable flies go wild slide. So when you can't control development, when you can't control the number of adult stable flies that are being produced, then all of these negative impacts to the cattle are occurring. And we have to do something about it, or we have to at least understand what those impacts are. And that's what my colleagues here are going to be presenting to you in the next few workshop sections.